joining. We are really excited to host David Autor today for our Insight Talk. He will be talking about how new job types counterbalance the erosive effect of task-displacing automation on labor demand and how new jobs have changed in the US since 1940. A little bit about David. He told me to keep this short, so I will keep it short. He's a professor and associate department head at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Department of Economics, yay, course 14, and also co-leads the MIT Task Force for the Future. So thank you so much, David, for being here with us.
Great. Pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. All right. So this talk is about the origins and content of new work. And I should mention this is co-authored with Anna Solomons, who's a professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and Brian Segmiller, who's a PhD student at MIT. So the concern that this research is directed towards is this idea that there's a shrinking set of tasks that workers can do better than machines. And that set could be shrinking, getting smaller and smaller. And so this is articulated in a book by the economist Daniel Susskind called A World Without Work, where he says machines will not do everything in the future, but they will do more and more. And as they slowly but relentlessly take on more and more tasks, human beings will be forced to retreat to an ever-shrinking set of activities. And I should say that this idea that has kind of precedent. So in 1983, the Nobel laureate in economics Vasily Leontief wrote, progressive introduction of new computerized, automated, and robotized equipment can be expected to reduce the role of labor, similar to the process by which the introduction of tractors and other machinery first reduced and then completely eliminated horses and other draft animals. So just to be clear, this is not what economists call the lump of labor argument, which is there's only so much work to do, so if you automate some, there's less for people to do. It's the notion about comparative advantage, and that eventually people just aren't competitive with alternative sources of supply of skills, because they have, even if wages go to zero, well, you still have to, people have to be fed, they have to be clothed, they need to be housed, maybe the machines are just cheaper at everything. So there's a lot of, I should say, I won't go deep into the economic literature, but there's a lot of evidence that we now have that there is a lot of automation that displaces people from work tasks, that displaces production workers, that displaces clerical workers and administrative workers. And one of the consequences of this has been the kind of polarization of the labor market, where we have a larger share of workers on the one hand doing professional, technical, and managerial work, paid, skilled, creative, secure. And on the other hand, a lot of generic in-person services like, food service, cleaning, entertainment, recreation, home health care, security, that use a kind of generic skill sets that require and rely on human dexterity and, sightedness and common sense, but don't require high levels of formal skills. And what automation has done is kind of eroded the set of middle skilled tasks that follow well understood rules and procedures and can increasingly be done by traditional software. And then artificial intelligence, of course, expands the domain of what's feasible. So a lot of evidence.
David?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I'm just going to take you up on the offer to interrupt. And if it's too early, please just let me know.
Go for it.
So I have a question about the task displacement, and I just want to make sure that I understand it right, because I've heard you speak about this issue before.
Oh, cool.
Some even within Google would take this point to mean that if automation and technology displaces tasks, does that necessarily mean that it doesn't displace employees and human beings? Because does that approach imply that ultimately? Because if that's the conclusion, then we have nothing to worry about.
So it's actually some of both. So clearly, in many cases, it displaces tasks without displacing workers, right? So it changes the nature of what people do without actually eliminating work per se. But then there are many things that, yes, you fully automate a job, right? I mean,
right.
Through a variety of ways, and we know there's lots of that throughout history, right? There's many jobs that are automated away, right? We used to, have all this work in agriculture. We used to have all this work in assembly lines. We used to have a lot of hand labor calculating things, right? So in many jobs, almost all jobs are changed, right, by automation technology. And anyway, for high skilled people, mostly what these technologies do is change the tools you use, not the fundamental work you're trying to accomplish. But in many other cases, there's just, steel mills now use, 5–10% of the employees they used to for the same set of output. And that's simply because so many of the other tasks have been automated. Okay. So yeah. I appreciate it. Keep them coming. So, So this, this kind of view of displacement, well, there's one economic answer that says, well, okay, that's fine. People do a smaller set of things, but they do them more productively, and so we're still complemented. It doesn't imply that, we're kind of running out of jobs, just means that people do a narrower and narrower set of activities. But if you, introspect for a minute, that doesn't really seem right? Because, it's probably not true that people just do the same old stuff more efficiently. It seems like we do more things, right? So is it work really narrower than it was 100 years ago when 40% of people were in agriculture, or is there new work? And there's that. And so, a well-known paper by an economist named Jeffrey Lynn in 2011 said, the set of tasks that people do is not static. And he actually used data from the US Census Bureau to show the addition of new job titles to the Census Bureau register of what people do effectively. And I'm going to explain more on that. We're going to build on his approach. He said, look, there's also new tasks in the world. And seizing on this idea, a bunch of well-known papers by my colleague Daron Acemoglu and Pasquale Restrepo, who's an economist at BU, sort of says, hey, we can think of this kind of like a two-part process where on the one hand, you have automation that's continually kind of eroding the set of tasks that people do because things get automated. But then you could have new task creation that is, reinstating what people do in some other domain, right? Creating new activities. And that's the goal of this project. And I would just say there's very limited evidence on this idea other than this original paper from 2011. So the goal of this project is to consistently measure the emergence of new work over 80 years, to explore its kind of technological and economic origins, technological meaning its relation to innovation, economic meaning its relationship to incentives, and then ask how this affects employment and wages. So that's the big, big goal. So let me just motivate this a tiny bit. This is a picture of all of US employment in 1940 in 12 broad mutually exclusive occupations, arrayed roughly from lowest paying to highest paying. So from agriculture to production work to managers. And this is the count of workers. So there's about 45 million workers in the US labor force in 1940. And you can see the two biggest categories are production work and agricultural work, and they account for about 40% of all employment. Fast forward to 2018, and the labor force is 3 times as large as it was in 1940. But some sectors are smaller, like farming and mining, or production. And I say smaller, this is despite the tripling of the labor force, right? There are fewer people in absolute terms working in those activities. Now I want to draw your attention to this red versus the green bar. The green bar in 2018 refers to employment in 2018 in job titles that existed in 1940. The red bar refers to employment in 2018 to job titles that were not present at that time. And what you can see roughly is about 2/3 of employment today is in job titles that had not yet been invented as of 1940. I'm going to be much more specific about what I mean by a job title. It's not a broad occupation. It's a much narrower description of a type of work. And so what we want to do is document these titles and talk about this new work and discuss where it comes from. So essentially, we're going to have, let me just sort of lay out in very informal terms. We're going to distinguish between 2 forms of innovations. We're going to call them augmentation and automation. So automation is when you take an existing task and you transfer it from labor to capital. Augmentation is when you increase the set of activities that are done or the value of services in a way that potentially, creates new work, new things for people to do. And so we're going to hypothesize that augmentation leads to the creation of new tasks, whereas automation does not. Automation eliminates tasks. Secondly, we're going to also say that hypothesize that new task creation, the emergence of new tasks, responds elastically to economic circumstances, meaning that if there's an incentive to create new work, if there's growing demand, you will see it occur. And demand moves the other direction, you'll see it not occur. The rate of new emergence will slow. And then finally, that augmentation and automation both occur in the same places, but they have different implications for labor demand. The way we write it, we hypothesize it is automation depresses employment and tends to depress wages. Augmentation may simultaneously create employment and raise wages, even though they're occurring in the same set of activities, as I'll show you in a minute. So that's kind of very loosely what those are our hypotheses, and they're formalized in the paper. Okay, so so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to first tell you how we measure and measure new work and describe it for you. Then I'm going to talk about how we distinguish between task creating and task replacing innovations, or what we call automation and augmentation. Then I'm going to talk about these economic sources having to do with technological advances and labor demand shifts. Then we talk about the kind of net employment effects. And then I want to end by just giving you a really recent example of why this matters. Now, I'm attentive to the time, so I may not get through all this. I reserve the right to skip stuff. All right. So the first thing we want to do, so there are three data sources that are the key inputs to our work. They are on the left-hand side of this three-part figure, and I'm going to put this out several times, is the thing we use to measure new titles occurring in the world. Then the next two buckets have to do with ways we measure innovations and classify them as either augmentation or automation innovations based upon patents. And then we're ultimately going to link these things together to look at the relationship between these innovations and task automation versus task augmentation. So starting with this first one, how do we find new job titles? So every decade, the US Census Bureau puts out a detailed list of occupation and industry titles. There are about 15 to 30,000 per volume for occupations, 10 to 20,000 for industries. And each one is a title is classified to a broad category of 300 or 400 occupations or industries in a decade that you would see in public use data. But these titles, these micro titles, as we call them, they're coding aid for the Census Bureau. So you have these employees that people write in, what do you do? And someone writes it in, and then they have to look it up in this phone book and then give it a number. And so we're going to use those. We digitize those or keyed them from 1930 to present. Now you might say, okay, well, how does that help you find new work? Well, here's like from the introduction of the 1990 volume. It says this list contains approximately 30,000 occupations, comprehensive. It's continuously updated through review of census and survey questionnaire. So the basic content of the 1990 index is derived largely from previous editions. However, about 1,000 new titles have been added to the industry and occupation listings. So basically, census employees, when they come across something that's written in a number of times, they haven't seen it before, they go to a supervisor and say, what's this? And then the supervisor says, oh, that's a thing, and it gets added to this volume, right? So this kind of creates a record of things being added. That's not the intention, but it's there. And this is what was first noticed by Jeffrey Lynn in 2011. So we're going to build on this. So this is like what a page from the 1990 Census Alphabetical Index of Occupations looks like. So in the first column, you see these what we call micro titles. And they're incredibly detailed, right? These are not job titles. So, for example, you would see a bobbin doffer, a bobbin dryer, a bobbin dumper, a bobbin fixer, a bobbin girl, a bobbin hauler, a bobbin man, bobbin marker. So how did you even begin to suspect there was more than one bobbin occupation, right? Probably not. The next column, so this gives you some examples. So like a blurb writer, a board chairman, a bodybuilder. These are all examples of these micro occupations. In the next column, we'll tell you an industry restriction, what industry that occupation is associated with. So for example, for a board chairman, would be associated with banking and savings, or a bodybuilder would be associated with motor vehicles and motor vehicle equipment. And then the third column gives you the occupation code to which it is classified, which is what appears in public use data. So what we do is we compare these volumes successively. We obtain new titles from job titles from fuzzy string matches, and then a lot of manual rework, because there's a lot of changes in vocabulary that don't reflect changes in titles. So if something goes from a gendered to a non-gendered pronoun, or they reorder the sequence of words. So it's actually, a lot of manual labor. But we come up with these lists, and we can find the new titles and what major occupations they're associated with, and use that to measure the flow of new work from decade to decade. So just to give you some examples to make this concrete. So here are some examples that have been added by decade to this alphabetical index. So in 1940, an automated welding machine operator, textile chemist in 1960, a controller of remotely piloted vehicles in 1980, an AI specialist in 2000. So this thing is actually not a lagging indicator, right? Things come in early. Or in 2018, a pediatric vascular surgeon. But not all the new work is tech work, right? You might think, oh, it's people who make new technology or install new technology or sell new technology or integrate new technology. But actually, a lot of them are services, specialized services. So, acrobatic dancer, a pageant director, a hypnotherapist, an amusement park worker, a sommelier, a drama therapist. And these reflect basically changing wealth, changing preferences, changing demographics that often create, like, for example, either new childcare occupations or new healthcare occupations. And the thing I want you to think about is that you might say, well, what really are these really new? Well, almost all these examples require some specialized skill or expertise or training, right? That is in some sense a new. So, for example, when we see a pediatric vascular surgeon, right? Obviously, there have been doctors for centuries, but that's a highly specialized activity. And the reason it's new is because it requires an additional layer of expertise or training to do that activity, right? So it really is. And you could say, look, it's a function of technology and R&D and all kinds of things, but it's creating a new demand for human expertise, and that's true for many of these services, although they're not high tech. Okay, so let me kind of describe this, and I think you can already see the potential payoff to just documenting these facts. So this shows you between 1940 and 1980 the distribution of new and pre-existing work done by people with high school or lower education. So let me just say we can assign these titles probabilistically to education groups. So if you look at 1940, most work done by people without a college degree was found in construction, transportation, production, and clerical work. And the red bars were very comparable to the blue bars, meaning the flow of new things being introduced was very similar to the things, what people were doing. And so, they were kind of moving in the same direction. And let me just say, it's important that I've ordered this from low paying to high paying, right? So most of this non-college work was in the middle of the distribution, right? Middle paid work in construction, transportation, production, clerical, admin. Fast forward to the next 4 decades, and what you see is the stock of existing work is still concentrated in construction, transportation, production, clerical, admin, but the flow of work has changed a lot. The largest single category of new work for people without college degrees is in personal services, right? Many of those would be those low paid generic work that we were talking about. Additionally, you'll find some of it at the high end and some at the low end, but it's important to see it's not in the middle. So the kind of distribution of where new work is occurring for whom is changing. Now, let me make the same figure for college graduates. You can see between 1940 and 1980, new work and existing work are heavily concentrated in high stuff, professionals, managers, also in clerical. And notice there's a lot of new clerical work that's coming online. Right? If we go to the next 4 decades, right, it becomes even more concentrated in the right. Particularly, you see a lot of growth of professionals and technical work. And notice, by the way, that clerical actually shrinks, right? So due to automation, there's actually less clerical work being created, new clerical work. Okay, so that kind of gives you a sense of what's happening over time. And you can see in this figure, particularly the one on the right here, this kind of polarization of employment, right? That kind of the new work for non-college workers is kind of moving to the tails, away from these middle paid jobs. So now what we want to do is we want to link this to innovation, right? Our hypothesis is that some of this, not all of this, has a technological basis, and that we want to think of there being 2 different types of innovations going on. One are what we call automation innovations that basically subsume existing tasks, and the other being augmentation innovations that potentially create new work. And the question is, how can we find those things? So what we do is we now use some natural language processing techniques, and we take the decennial, again, this alphabetical index of occupations that describes all the titles of everything everyone does, and we link them to the corpus of US patents. And I'll explain how we do that. Look for overlaps between these titles describing what work people do and the patents. And I'll make it clear. So for example, here's an example. So here's from 1990 again. Here's bookkeepers, accounting, and auditing clerks. And these are the titles, the industries as they're associated with, and the occupations. And you can see that these kind of describe the outputs that they create. So for example, a foreign exchange position clerk, or foreign currency exchange, or accounting office, accounting firm, accounting clerk, accounts receivable clerk. So these are all things that describe effectively the outputs that someone creates. And we're going to look for patents that mention those outputs. I'll be more precise on that in 1 second. We're also going to do a similar exercise, and we're going to use something called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles that effectively describes the inputs that people put into their work. What are the actual tasks they accomplish? So here's the page for the DOT for bookkeepers, right? And it says, oh, they keep records, they verify and post details of transactions, they reconcile balances and accounts, and so on. So we think of these as roughly describing the one on the right describing the inputs into someone's work, their tasks, and the ones on the left describing the outputs, the thing they produce. And so we're going to look for patterns that match the inputs and the outputs. And our hypothesis is that patterns that match the inputs are going to look like automation. patents that match the outputs are going to look more like augmentation. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to take these three corpora. One is the census alphabetical index, one is the patents, one is the cleaned dictionary of occupational titles. We're going to strip punctuation, remove stop words, retain nouns and verbs, lematize, etc. Stuff you know all better than me. Then we're going to extract vectors of word embeddings, right? So word embeddings are, geometric representations of the meanings of words, right? So they effectively account for synonyms or related words. So colors will be geometrically closer to each other than, numbers versus colors, right? Or, the words, compute and contemplate, right, will be related in this dimension, even though they're not synonyms for one another. We're then going to weight them up and look for similarities between the word embeddings of the patents and the word embeddings on the one hand of the list of occupations and industries, this alphabetical index, and on the other, the dictionary of occupational describing what they do, occupational titles. And this is going to give us the exposure of an occupation or industry to automation, which is this lower quadrant, or augmentation, this upper quadrant. And the key thing I want to emphasize is we're using the same corpus of patents, right? We're not doing any hand tuning or pruning here. We're running them through the same algorithm, looking in a very hands-off way for differences in the content of these patents such that they implicate either effectively a patent that claims to accomplish the task accomplished by a worker, or a patent that essentially claims to potentially relate to the output of an occupation or industry. Okay, so just to give you a tiny example, I keep going back to these bookkeeper examples. Here are some augmentation patents: universal credit card, electronic cash register, two-part bank draft, cash processing system. Here are the ones that our algorithm flags as automation, right? Check verification, check processing, automated bank transaction security, fraudulent card intercept system. There's not a perfect distinction between those. You could make a case that they all have elements of both. And I'll show you, in fact, they're highly correlated. So this is occupations. On the y-axis here is their percentile of exposure to automation. On the x-axis is their percentile of exposure to augmentation. And many things are clustered along the diagonal, meaning they're exposed to a lot of both. So for example, if you're a assembler of electrical equipment, you're exposed to a lot of automation and a lot of augmentation. If you're a childcare worker, you're not exposed to much of either. On the other hand, if you're a pharmacist or a cabinet maker, you're exposed to a lot of automation and not a lot of augmentation. So we might expect that occupation to tend to shrink. If you're a mechanical engineer or an operation and systems research analyst, as far as we can tell, you're not exposed to a lot of automation, but you're exposed to a lot of augmentation. So we might expect the opposite to occur. So that's what we're going to be looking for. So what I'm going to do is now walk you through the results, how we use these data. So the first thing we do is we're going to look at how occupations, where new titles emerge as a function of their exposure, of occupations' exposure to these measures of automation and augmentation. Before I do that, I just want to kind of make a key point that underlying this analysis is the idea that the locus of patents is potentially changing a lot over time. And so if innovation is related to occupations, where innovation occurs is going to affect which occupations are exposed. And you can see, just looking at this is kind of a stacked area plot of all patents across 11 groups, how the Patent Office groups them between 1900 and 2018, effectively. And you can see from 1900 to 1940, this is kind of in the machine age. Most of the patents are in transportation, manufacturing processes, and engineering, construction, mining. And if you kind of look from 1940 to 1980, it's kind of the age of better living through chemistry, right? The biggest growing group is chemistry and metallurgy. And then you look from 1980 forward, and you can see what happens is two categories come to dominate all patents. One is instruments and innovation, instruments and information, and the other is electricity and electronics, right? So you can see a very clear break as we move into the information age. And so to the degree that those patents affect different groups of occupations, they're going to shift where new work is created and where new work is automated. Okay. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I didn't want to.
No problem. No, I appreciate it.
You kind of alluded to this point in the prior graph, but Clearly, not all innovations and technology advancements are protected by patents, and we do see them concentrated, as you just mentioned, in certain industries. This doesn't necessarily imply that innovation and technology is not affecting augmentation, let's say, in other sectors. Is that something that you can control for?
Oh yeah, so we're not. Well, maybe I may if I understood the question. So we're just using all patents, right, and linking them to all occupations. So we're not saying, oh, it's information age, this period,
Right.
mechanical. So we're not taking a stand on that. We're letting the data speak to that. Now, but I'm not sure if that fully answered your question. So let me give you a chance to respond.
So let me just clarify. So David, I think what I'm ultimately curious about is, if we know that patents is kind of a subset of the technologies and innovations that are taking place and affecting the workforce, are there other elements that we're actually ignoring or that we could incorporate in the study?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah. So this is not a complete catalog of all the things that are going on. And in fact, the second thing I'll turn to is other demographic shifts that also affect automation. And in the last example, I'll talk about COVID.
Okay.
So
I should have just waited with my question.
No. It's good to ask the question. It's quite constructive because it is important. We're hoping to show how this process works, but in some sense it doesn't. We don't claim to be able to measure all of it, and that's a limitation of what we're doing. In fact.
Sure.
Okay. So this just shows you. So here we look at. I'll just describe what we're doing. We're looking to ask at the flow of new titles by broad occupation over 8 decades, right? So this breaks the world up into those same 12 occupations I used initially. The x-axis is the percentile of exposure to augmentation patterns, what we call augmentation patterns, in each 4-decade period, 1940 to 1980. On the y-axis is the count of new titles emerging. And these are all done in quantiles rather than in levels. And then these little regression lines are basically the best fit of the relationship between those two. So you can see of these 24 lines, 23 of them are positive. And what they say is very robustly clear is in occupations that are exposed to more, quote, augmentation patterns as we measure them, we do see more new titles emerging, more new work is emerging as we measure it. Now, let's not take a stand yet on whether that's a good or bad thing, whether that new work matters. Right now, we're just trying to say, hey, where does it come from, right? And let me and you might say, well, okay, but fine, where stuff is occurring, you see new work, what does that mean? Is there really a difference between automation and augmentation, right? So now I'm going to show you a kind of a regression model that tries to look at that. So in this table, I present a regression. The dependent variable here is effectively the emergence of new titles. And then I'm controlling for augmentation and automation. And without going to details, for those of you who are not familiar with regression models, just look at the asterisks. if there's an asterisk, it tells you that it didn't happen by chance. It's very likely to be a non-random relationship. And then the sign, whether it's positive or negative, tells you if this relationship is a positive or a negative relationship. So in the first 3 columns, as I showed you a minute ago, where we see augmentation patterns popping up, we see new titles emerging. Now in the next 3 set of columns, the last 3 set of columns, I simultaneously put in automation patterns. These are positively correlated with one another. They occur in the same places, but it is the case that augmentation patterns predict the emergence of new titles, and automation patterns do not, conditional on augmentation. In other words, although they come from the same place and they occur similar places, they seem to have different economic content, and that our procedure is able to extract that, which is itself a surprise to us and pretty cool, right? Because again, we're not reading these patterns and making a statement. We're simply trying to target different domains of matching to see, if we can figure out what's going on there. So we do see this, and I want to say we don't see in our volumes, we don't see tasks being eliminated. The Census Bureau doesn't go and cull these volumes every 10 decades, say, oh, no one does that anymore, no one does that anymore, right? They just put new things emerging. So what we can see is where we see these augmentation patterns occurring, new things emerge. Where we see these other patterns occurring, nothing new pops out at that point. Now, let me give you another example. And this is actually relates to what Guy was asking about a minute ago. Innovation is not the only source of new work. So one thing so it's an idea we do look at here is we use different demand shocks that may affect the demand for occupations and therefore accelerate or decelerate the creation of new titles. So the example I'm going to use is the China trade shock, something I've worked on a lot. And in particular, we're going to measure the exposure of occupations to the China trade shock. So here's how you can see that. So we're looking at the kind of growth of Chinese imports between 1990 and 2018. We have a way of isolating kind of exogenous variation in that coming from China's rising productivity. And then this is, we present this measure of exposure. So here, this is the occupational exposure percentile. These are our 12 major occupations from least exposed to most exposed. So health services least exposed, production workers most exposed, technicians somewhere in between. The black dots show you their average degree of exposure. The rest of the dots show you the exposure within each of the detailed occupations. So for example, within production work, textile workers were the most exposed to the China trade shock. Power plant operators were the least exposed. That makes a lot of sense, right? Power plants were not imported, textiles were. But for example, if you look in technicians, programmers of numerically controlled machines were much more exposed than were sheriffs and bailiffs. Or electrical engineers were more exposed than primary school teachers, or janitors were more exposed than crossing guards, presumably because there are a lot of janitors in manufacturing plants. So this is our measure of exposure. And our expectation is that occupations that are more exposed to this inward contraction, there'll be less new title creation because there's less demand for new innovation. So that's what we show in this regression. You can see that occupations that are highly exposed to this trade shock, there's a deceleration in the rate of the emergence of new titles. Simultaneously, those that are exposed to augmentation, see more titles emerging. So these factors, consistent with Guy's question, are operating simultaneously, often in the same places. And by the way, I will say this same relationship is not present in 1980 and 1990, before the China trade shock occurs. So there are 2 points to take away from this. The first is, of course, that we do see, it does appear that, where do new tasks emerge? It's not just where we see these innovations occurring, but also wherever there's new demand, people are always inventing things, right? Whenever there's a growing sector, people are inventing new forms of yoga or new ways of fixing things or new software that does something cool, right? The second is, it also means that, at inward demand shocks, so for example, the China trade shock, not only do they reduce the count of workers, but they reduce the type of work, or they slow the emergence of new work, right? So it's actually a second margin on which these sort of shifts are, kind of potentially negative for workers, in the sense that it's not just that they reduce the number of jobs, but also the variety, or they mute the emergence of new variety of work. I will say we do another exercise where we use actually demographic changes to look for the same thing. So the age structure of the population has very predictable effects on which sectors are growing rapidly. So if you see a lot of kids born today, you can be sure that 12 years from now, there'll be a lot of bicycles being purchased, right? And so what's interesting is this is a scatter plot of of exposure from patents and exposure from these demographic demand shifts. And you can see they're actually pretty distinct. So for example, health occupations are being driven both by innovation and also by demographics. On the other hand, the growth of real estate occupations, funeral directors, waiters and waitresses, primary school teachers, and housekeepers is being driven by by demographics, right? So I like this one on the left because you sort of have all the phases of life, right? You go to primary school, you go out to dinner, you hire a housekeeper, you buy a house, then you go to the call a funeral director. Anyway, these are multiple sources. Okay, so right, so let me. I realize that I want to leave time for questions, so I'm really going to speak for maybe 5 additional minutes. So I want to now turn to the last 2 points. Is like, well, why should I care, right? So hopefully, one reason you might care so far, you say, oh wow, right? It's not the narrative that comes from a lot of research is what innovation does is effectively replaces human labor, and it does. That is correct. But simultaneously, there's another component of it, which is that it creates new things that people do in different places, and that may also be important. So that's kind of the story I told. Now I want to say, well, does that matter? Like, does it, we care if that affects things in net, right? Does it mean a net growth of work? Does it mean an increase in earnings? right? So the way we look at that is effectively we first look at employment within occupations. And we say, and what our prediction is that occupations that are exposed to a lot of automation will tend to contract. Occupations that are exposed to a lot of these augmentation technologies may tend to expand. And this is what we actually show in this figure. So this shows you each of these points is a group of occupations. And we're looking over the period between 1980 and 2018. And it says the more augmentation you're exposed to, holding automation fixed, the more growth we see within your occupation. The more automation you're exposed to, holding augmentation fixed, the more contraction we see in your occupation. And I think what's cool about this, as I said, is often the same occupations are exposed to both. So it's not one's happening here, one's happening there. It's really kind of, you can think of it as a race between the two, right? On the one hand, you have automation that's kind of displacing tasks, and the other you have augmentation that's creating new tasks. And so it's often a question of not one's here, one's there, but they're in the same place, which one's moving faster, right? And that affects the net effect. Now, the last thing I wanted to, so this is the employment side of this. So here in this figure, I put here the gap between augmentation and automation. So the more positive that is, the more augmentation, the more negative is, the more automation, right? So we can see that employment is growing in occupations that are exposed to more augmentation, contracting in occupations that are exposed to more automation. So now I want to turn to the wage side of this. Well, how does that affect wages in those, or how is that related to wage growth in those occupations? So the first thing to know is that whenever occupations grow, their wages tend to fall. The reason being actually is because young people enter them, right? And young people are paid less. And whenever occupations shrink, their wages tend to rise because older people are in them. That doesn't mean that holding skills constant, people are being paid more. It just means what we call a compositional shift. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first show you this unadjusted relationship, and then I'm going to account for those compositional changes by effectively taking account of the changes in the age and education structure and occupation, and accounting for those things, do wages rise or fall, net of those changes. So here's the employment side. Here is the worker composition. This just says that when occupations are more exposed to augmentation, we would predict that their wages would fall because actually young people are moving into them, in many cases less educated people. And we would predict that the wages in occupations exposed to automation would tend to rise because older people are hanging on in those occupations. The people with higher levels of education are more likely to persist in those occupations. However, when we account for that, once we adjust for those changes in composition, we actually see rising earnings. In other words, accounting for the type of people doing the work, it appears that both employment and earnings levels are rising. So that new work is different, or sorry, let me say augmentation is different, right? Not because on the one hand, it seems to be increasing the size of activities, not just contracting them, creating new work, and it seems to be associated with higher earnings levels, right? Even accounting for who's doing the work, it seems to be complementary to people. Okay, so let me end with one very concrete example of this. So you've all heard of COVID-19. Sorry. And so let me show you one way that the pandemic interacts with this process. So I'm going to draw on three figures from papers by Nick Bloom and Steve Davis, and co-authors of theirs. Nick is an economist at Stanford. Steve Davis is an economist at Chicago Booth School. And this figure shows the relationship between population density and expenditures near work, right? So people who work in dense downtown places spend more money per week near their jobs, right? So people who live in, if this is Manhattan or San Francisco, or Chicago, right? People who work in the densest places spend, $250, $300 a week near their office, whereas people who live in, suburban areas spend, $100. And what does that reflect? Well, it reflects, one, those places are more expensive, but two, they're harder to get in and out of. So people go, they commute there, they have lunch there, they have dinner there, right? They take clients out and so on. So we know, just as a matter of fact, that when people work in urban areas, they spend money downtown. A lot of it. It's also the case that employers plan for people who work in these dense areas to actually be coming in to work less, right? So in other words, they ask employers, how much do you expect workers to work from home going forward, and they related that to the population density of where those people work, and say, geez, the denser place you used to work, the more we expect you'll be spending time at home, right? So it's 25 to 30% of days in the most dense areas, and that makes sense too, right? Because those employers are thinking, well, my employees spend a lot of time commuting, and it's expensive for me to have marquee offices in these locations, and probably a lot of them are doing knowledge work. I'm going to let them work from home. Okay, so it's going to change where workers work. In fact, interestingly, if you ask people, and this is again from Bloom and co-authors, how many days would you like to spend working from home after the pandemic? And relate this to their annual earnings. Well, everybody says, well, about 2 days a week, right? So across the board, that's how much I would like to work from home. If you see what employers say, basically, for high wage workers, they're like 2 days a week. For low wage workers, they're basically saying, no, you're coming back to the office, right? So this is going to change where people work. Now, let me bring you to the final point of this. This is a figure that measures the percentage of new patent applications that support work from home technologies, right? So this is really, really flat. And then starting January 2020, this thing roughly increases by 200%, right? So from 0.5% of all patents to kind of 1.2% of all patents, so not quite 200%, now mention work from home technologies. Right? So this is an endogenous innovation response, is responding to the changed economic circumstances. And we know if a lot of those patents are what we call augmentation patents, right? Those are basically going to be increasing the productivity and demand for the highly skilled people who are going to be working from home, right? And so what this says is the pandemic is going to change the possibility of working from home. Employers are going to make sure that that's highly educated and highly skilled people who are doing that. And then technology is going to come in and augment what they do. Right? And so this is a way in which the relocation of where innovation occurs is going to change the type of jobs that occur. So this process of where innovation actually takes place affects the type of work people do by affecting what is automated and what is augmented. And I think it's safe to predict, although not certainty, that this movement of innovation towards work from home technologies will augment the people who do it. Right? And so will be kind of beneficial to the pandemic. I just have to say, if you were trying to design like a dread, virological event that would have incredibly disequalizing effects by making life better for the highly skilled and worse for everybody else, COVID would be your best answer to that question, right? So, and this just suggests another way in which that is going to unfold even now, even as we speak, and when the pandemic is over. Okay, so let me just wrap up. So, 4 major points. One is that this notion of new work is quantitatively important. As we measure it, about 2/3 of what people do at present, are things that didn't exist in 1940. And just to give you like a super highly, concrete example, in 1940, there were 83 titles for auto mechanics. In 2018, there are 143. And many of those titles refer to things that were not present in 1940 cars. So there's several types of air conditioning mechanics, right? There are fuel injection mechanics. There are disc brake mechanics. None of those technologies were found in cars in 1940, except there was one car that had air conditioning in 1939. So there's a lot of new work that's being created. The locus of that work. So I think a lot of economists would say, look, we haven't seen evidence that we're running out of work, but the type of work that we're doing is changing, and it's not beneficial for everybody. And in particular, the creation, the type of work that people are doing is increasingly complementary to people with specialized trained skills, and increasingly substitutes for people who do, follow rules and procedures, and increasingly perhaps even in a lot of, dexterous manual activities when robots get fingers, as Greg was saying earlier. And we can see that in these data. A lot of the new work used to be concentrated in blue collar and office occupations, and now it's not, right? It's moved, new work for non-college workers is moved into these personal services, which is generally tend to be low paid because the skill sets are not highly specialized. This movement of where new titles occurs is not an autonomous process, right? It responds to where innovation investments are made, and it responds to where demand shifts, right? So we should not, although when people say, oh, it's technology, they tend to think, probably you guys don't think, because they say, oh, technology, that's like, stuff, falls from heaven, or someone at a lab bench goes, eureka, new thing, it does this. But of course, it's not that way, right? Technology are created, they're engineered to do what they do, right? So those decisions affect where people choose to focus, which response to incentives, right, affects what type of work is created and what skills it needs. And so task displacement and new task creation are occurring simultaneously. And the way, probably the net effect they're having on work is not changing the quantity per se, but what skills are becoming more valuable, where new work is emerging and not being augmented, and which skills are becoming more redundant as automation is proceeding rapidly and augmentation is not occurring. So to kind of sum up, in my little, branch of research, right, this notion of new work is kind of like the kind of the dark matter of the task universe, right? Like we think it exists, but we don't know how much there is of it and where it comes from. And so this project, the objective is to try to measure it and say what's in it, what tasks, and then where does it come from? And so this, I think, gives us a sense of the kind of that landscape. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll welcome your questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen. So I'm.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience?
I have a couple questions, but I don't, unless anybody else wants to go first. I'll take the opportunity. So 2 questions, but David, first, this is remarkable. It is so innovative to take something such as patents and to try and draw from that some kind of perhaps even a normative statement about how technology actually impact the workplace, right? Because we're in this ongoing debate, as you can imagine, right? Whether we actually help workers or whether we don't. And just that use of that framework of thinking about some patent be helpful in some way where some actually raise some tensions. I at least think it's tremendously innovative.
Thank you. Let me say, to be fair, other people we're not the first to use patents and relate them to work. Certainly there's a huge literature on this, and there's recent papers that show actually patents that appear to displace workers. I think the contribution here is that we've sort of identified this second axis of innovation. That's the augmentation side. And I think, and just not to say one trumps the other, but just to say, hey, we can measure this other force happening and try to understand it better.
Right. And you cite that literature in the deck as well. And I think it's the combination of the two that really adds value, at least from the industry perspective, from a policy perspective. And I think that kind of leads me to, so the first question ended up being a comment, I guess. The second question, more importantly, is, from where we stand for Google as a digital platform, what does this framework, or can it be used to say something about what we do? How does our technology map with respect to those criteria? Is there data that we can look into? Are questions that we can address using the framework?
Yeah, actually, I hadn't thought about it. But yeah, we could, in theory, right? We're still refining what we're doing. We expect to do better. But we could then go say, hey, here's the technologies that are identified by this corporation, corporate owner, right? And say, what are they associated with? What occupations, right? Whether they're more augmentation or automation, for example. So yeah, that is feasible. And then you could also, and say, oh, which do you think of our patents are those things, right? We're quite hands off about this. We're not really peaking. We're interested, but it's not that. There's a lot. There's hundreds of thousands. And then you could also, and I think this is the greater challenge, and this is what we're discussing at the beginning. It's hard to figure out. I think it's hard to figure out. Some of my colleagues don't think this. I think it's hard to figure out how, if your objective is, like Eric Schmidt once said to me, he says, I would like someone to write me an app that raises the wage of the middle class workers by 15%, right? Like, I'll buy that app. Like, come on, right? And the joke was, we don't know how to do that, right? And so, it's easy to say as an engineering objective, I want a technology that, produces this, right? It's actually hard to say as an engineering objective, I think, I want a technology that complements non-college labor workers. Maybe it's feasible. I don't want to say it isn't, but it's not a standard objective, right? And the reason I'll say why is it not a standard objective is because what economists say is demand for labor is what we call derived demand. Nobody wants workers, right? They want things done, and then workers are an input into this. If you could do the same thing without the workers, you would do it, right? It's like I don't have demand for electricity. I don't consume electricity. I want electricity to do something else, right?
So let me ask you a quick thing, because
I was going to say, Greg, Kaleni has a hand raised. If we can call on her.
Go ahead, Kaleni.
Hi there. Just want to build on this point here. I've seen a lot about new work being created and the wages of those work being valuable. But to your point about for all those people that the effects are actually detrimental because they don't have the skills, they don't have the ability to do that, to maybe adapt, or the work that they, the middle skill kind of work is what's going away. How are you guys thinking of, is there any research that's being done to kind of dive into that problem a bit more, help us understand how we could kind of support that, to your point earlier?
Yeah, so this is actually, so if you go to our workofthefuture.mit.edu website, so we have 2 big reports and 20 short papers about different aspects of this problem. And I think it's a challenge. It's happening in all industrialized countries that you see this kind of hollowing out, but it's had very different effects in different countries because they have different sets of supporting institutions, right? So the US has very few guardrails. So, low-paid people in the U.S. earn very little by world standards, right? Even by standards of rich countries, right? You go to Canada and you make 30% more as a McDonald's worker, and they're not 30% more productive. I'm sure you've been to what is the Canadian McDonald's? I want to say Carl Rogers, but I don't mean Carl Rogers.
Tim Hortons.
Tim Hortons, thank you. Right, exactly, right? Not 30% more productive, right? So they have different set of supporting institutions about the safety net, about worker retraining, about labor standards, and about a set of expected benefits having to do with healthcare, family and medical leave, paid vacation. So countries have taken the same set of ingredients having to do facing technological and globalization pressures, but they have remixed them to produce somewhat different outcomes. The pie is growing in almost all these countries, but the distribution is changing quite differently. They all see more inequality, but not to the same extent. So So that's one answer, is that the institutions affect. The other is, of course, where we choose to invest and innovate, right? And that will affect, right? So if there's a lot more, let's say we have a huge infrastructure bill, not only will that create more jobs, but it'll create new work for people without college degrees to do expert work in manufacturing. Where manufacturing occurs, it doesn't just create more jobs, it creates more skilled opportunities and more opportunity for specialization. So you can affect the type of work. Now I'm not making an argument for like heavy industrial policy to bring back textiles to the US. That's a kind of hopeless cause. But even I think when and this is the hardest question for me, but one that you probably have much more leverage on, right? When you're thinking about what AI tools should we build, right? You could say, well, what would be something that would potentially I want to make, people who are airplane mechanics or auto mechanics, I want to make them more productive, right? Just like giving pneumatic hammers to people who are roofers makes them more productive, right? We don't think that we're helping them. We're giving them better tools. We're not making them irrelevant. So I would like to take Google Glass, for example, and make it so that people could access the design of the thing they're fixing and be much more productive at it. So I think part of it is the mindset of, are we trying to eliminate this person, or are we trying to use their skills more effectively? And that may choose what set of problems you work on and even the way you work on them, right? So here's a good example, right? Think of the Apple Store versus the Amazon store, right? The Apple Store is so labor intensive, it's amazing, right? They're not doing checkout. Nobody's doing checkout, right? They're just there for this high-end customer experience. And then the Amazon store there's no people. It's all, just electronic checkout. Those are 2 different engineering objectives, right? That's not a characteristic of the technology. That's a characteristic of the design of what you were trying to accomplish. And I'm not trying to put a moral value on that. Obviously, those are different businesses, different margins, and so on. But I'm just saying there's a lot of choice, and it's a mistake to think that that the future is something we wait around and see what happens, right? The future is something that we all collectively create, And the belief that you don't have a role in that is also a choice about the future. And of course, you know that very well, but the tools and where you focus your energy does affect what people will do going forward.
And thank you so much for your time and for speaking with us. This has
Oh,
been
yeah.
really insightful and wonderful.
Oh, no, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.